start. So thank you for your patience in waiting for us. And we have the panel for this afternoon. And I give the floor to the colleague that is going to chair. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all. I would like to thank the organizers of this Congress, Professor Lo Giudice and Professor Farah, for giving me the opportunity to participate in a prestigious conference based on topics of special interest. The themes are many, and the papers will offer an adequate discussion of them. I would just like to say a few words about some of them. The first argument concerns the protection of environment. European Union citizens benefit from some of the highest environmental standards in the world. The European Union and national governments have set clear objectives to guide European environment policy until 2020 and the vision beyond that, or where to be by 2050 with the support of research programs, legislation, and funding special. Environmental protection and innovation contribute to create new business and employment opportunities, which encourage further investment. Green growth is at the heart of European Union policy to ensure that European economic growth is environmentally sustainable. The European Union also carries out a fundamental role in promoting sustainable development globally. So, another important concept of this panel is the sustainable development. Its conservation supports the environmental balance. People cannot overexploit natural resources to satisfy their own needs for life and sustainability. People must keep the heart within the carrying capacity of the Earth's resources. The Earth has limited resources, and we must protect it for future generations, which is why adopting sustainable development practices is vital to the success and longevity of society and human life. We must work to reverse the environmental damage that we've caused by exploiting our natural resources in order to provide for present and future generations without compromising the ability of their survival. Understanding the principles of sustainable development is vital to ensuring the success of our environment, economy, and society. We can work together and share in the ability of future generations to work to save our planet for climate change through sustainable development processes, working to make our world a more sustainable place. The well-thought of sustainable development processes, the well-recognized principle of sustainable development for the protection and improvement of environment has been unanimously accepted by the world countries as a strategy that caters to the needs of the present without depriving the future generations of their right to available natural resources. It has been rightly said that sustainable development is meant to secure a balance between developmental activities for the benefits of the people and environmental protection of future generations. For nearly 20 years, sustainable development has been one of the fundamental objectives of the European Union since it was included in the Treaty of Amsterdam as an important objective of European Union policies. The Treaty of European Union sets out the European Union vision for a sustainable development of Europe based on balanced economic growth and price stability, a highly competitive social market economy, aiming at full employment and social progress, an high level of protection and improvement of the quality of the environment. Okay, now I give the floor to two important speakers that have the same relations. Okay, Professor Kotzé and Professor Adelman, which will give a report by the title Environmental Law and the Unsustainability of Sustainable Development, a tale of disenchantment and of hope.
Thank you. It is good to be at a conference with live people rather than virtual people again. Louis and I are going to split the presentation of our paper. And we may, as you will hear, set some cats among the pigeons in terms of development and sustainable development. So clearly we are at a time of polycrisis, a climate crisis, a climate emergency, food, energy and water insecurity, which has been intensified by the pandemic and now by the insanity of the war in Ukraine. And this is the polycrisis of what is now widely called the Anthropocene, which I agree with Andrea is, we find a deeply problematic concept because it ascribes equal responsibility to all human beings, irrespective of history, time, place, and context. Now, this polycrisis, we argue, is intensified by the vicious cycle of endless extractive growth and indebtedness. And because of the energy crisis, because of the pandemic, the global south is now experiencing the greatest debt problem since the 1990s. And so the question that I want to consider in this first part of our presentation is the extent to which liberal democracy is able to deliver sustainability. Now, I would assume, although I shouldn't, that most of us, that first two things. One, that liberal democracy is in deep problems in many, many parts of the world. But it is better than illiberal democracy of the Hungarian type or the managed democracy of the Russian type. But the underlying problem in terms of our paper is that liberal democracy is unsustainable in every sense of the word, apart from democracy. It is unsustainable economically, and it is unsustainable environmentally. Now, our focus on the first part of the paper that we are soon going to publish, or which will soon be published, is a critique of the idea of development. Now, development is normally understood as something positive, for example, in relation to child development. But economic development, the development of what we now call the global south, was a Western invention at the end of the Second World War, designed to incorporate what was then called the Third World into the global political economy on unequal terms, to enable northern countries to be able to continuously expropriate and exploit the natural resources of the global south. And we've heard talk earlier today about permanent sovereignty over natural resources, etc. It is noticeable that in Andean cosmovisions like Buen Vivir, which we refer to in our paper, the indigenous peoples of Latin America have no concept similar to development. Development is an alien idea. So we're faced with questions at a conference like this about the extent to which liberal democracy is capable of dealing with a multi-generational, deterritorialized problem, a transboundary global problem, and the malfunctioning of the post-Second World War so-called liberal international system. Some people refer to it as the international liberal order, but since it is a disorder, I prefer to use the word system. I also, in my work, have been, which at the moment is focusing on climate justice, I'm attempting to understand the extent to which liberalism facilitates or facilitates climate justice or not. And I look, for example, at the inadequacy of certainly in the Anglosphere, the work of John Rawls, which is regarded as the canonical work of justice in the Anglosphere. And the problems he had in trying to extend his theory of justice beyond the territorial state to the global level. Much more congenial is the work of Amartya Sen on development as freedom. I'm trying to conceive development in non-economic terms that doesn't require endless growth. And Sen has made a huge contribution to the UN system, to the Human Development Index, to the work of the World Bank and others. But what Sen's work has not been able to do is to resist the identification of development with growth. Sen's work has been unable to be, or has not successfully been used to resist the encroachment of environmental destruction through growth-driven extractive development. So what we are saying in this paper is that development is intrinsically problematic. So long as it is understood as requiring growth, and growth is required to pay debt, etc., then we have a problem. We have a problem so long as GDP remains the overwhelming measure of development and so-called progress. And we see, although we've had references and discussions about the WTO earlier today, the Grundnorm of the global political economy today is trade and not sustainability. And as Louis will also emphasize, there is a gulf between sustainable development and ecological sustainability. And so we need to escape the ideology of developmentalism and the oxymoron of sustainable development, which Louis will refer to. We need to consider the relationship between classical liberalism and neoliberalism, and the role that both have played in relation to issues like private property, consumption, the construction of Homo economicus, etc. I want to raise two more issues and then hand over to Louis. First, the problem of sovereignty, which is at the center of the so-called international liberal international system. Sovereignty and sovereign exceptionalism, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Putin, America always. Sovereign exceptionalism undermines the collective responses to a transnational problem. And so here we have this tension, the question, if individuals are at the center of liberal philosophy, What is the role of the individual in relation to the collective problem of global heating? And we can see the problems of sovereignty, of the necessity for consensus in international environmental law, for example, in various ways. Within the past month, I thought about three things that have taken place. First, the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, which ended on the 3rd of June and which Louis attended, which followed 50 years ago, the World Conference on Environment and Development. You may have missed what happened in Stockholm early in June if you blinked. Nothing happened. Nobody knows about it. And the second are the negotiations that have broken down in failure in Nairobi in the last week on the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the gathering of sovereigns, these magical gatherings of sovereigns that put out lots of words without preventing ecological destruction, without achieving sustainability. And the third is the first agreement in nearly 2 decades in the WTO to phase out subsidies for fishing without actually solving or attempting to resolve the problem of unsustainable overfishing. And here we have the WTO is one, well, it's not quite one of the post-war Bretton Woods institutions that were the World Bank, IMF, etc., that were at the core of the liberal international system, but it is still overwhelmingly powerful in terms of promoting a trade agenda rather than a sustainability agenda. So, just to emphasize again that it's almost tautological today to state that development is intrinsically flawed because it requires endless growth on a finite planet. But reconciling growth with environmental protection was what the Brundtland Commission set out to do at the World Conference on Environment and Development in Our Common Future in 1972. They failed because sustainable development is impossible if it is merely another form of development. But to focus more clearly on sustainable development, I'll now hand over to Louis.
Thank you, Sam. So just to pick up from where Sam left off, I want to turn our attention more pertinently to the issue of sustainable development. And I must say we are less optimistic about it than our chair seems to be. Hopefully we will be sufficiently provocative to illustrate the points that we do want to make. So as Sam has already said, sustainable development is central to the current global development vision. And it is a central concept of the type of development vision that he has explained to us now. It acts as both a pivotal point of orientation of environmental law and policy, and also as the basic principle that anchors and that orientates the entire global environmental law and governance order. Sustainable development, as we know, has emerged in the 1970s with the noble idea that individuals would favor development that enhances human well-being and social justice while protecting the environment. And that's all good, because it was originally conceived as a discourse of resistance which fused radical environmental consciousness with a critical rethinking of a failed development enterprise. And it did so at that time by highlighting the scarcity and limits, affluence and poverty, global inequality, and the environmental viability of Westernization. But over the years, sustainable development has metamorphosed into a perverse ideological paradigm that provides the overarching basis for organizing the beliefs, the subjectivities, and the values of all individuals, and thus producing and reproducing a certain social order in its multiple dimensions, from the individual to the institutional. And as we know, neoliberalism acts as the broader context for the continuing hegemony of mainstream models of development, of which sustainable development is the most recent incarnation. More recently, the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change has yet again exposed the limits of sustainable development and the inequalities occasioned by its neoliberal mindset. And these predatory mainstream models of development, as Sam has mentioned, contribute to the socio-ecological crisis of the Anthropocene by further exacerbating systemic inequalities and injustices, repeatedly generating economic crises and driving habitat destruction that intensify the vulnerability of the living order. And this is anything but sustainable development. It's only development. And let us be clear again, the point that you also made. It is not all humans that are implied in causing the destruction that we are talking about here, or the socio-ecological crisis of the Anthropocene. It is a specific type of privileged human that sits at the top of the hierarchy of the living order, as many critical legal scholars such as Anna Greer, for example, have shown. Now, international environmental law, the specific focus of my part of the presentation, has played a pivotal role, we believe, in turning sustainable development into the normatively, politically, economically, and socially powerful concept that it is. And international environmental law is therefore complicit in promoting a socio-ecologically destructive understanding of sustainable development, ironically, in the body of law that is supposed to protect the vulnerable living order. We're not talking about trade law, we're talking about environmental law. So international environmental law therefore legitimizes a wide range of socio-ecologically destructive practices under the banner of sustainable development. In fact, international law and sustainable development have become so deeply intertwined that some scholars even say that they observe the existence of a body of law called International Sustainable Development Law, whatever that is. Now, whether or not you agree with such a taxonomy or not, sustainable development appears at least to have become the foundational constitutional principle of international environmental law, very similar to Hans Kelsen's notion of a Grundnorm. And of greater concern, it has become the core ethical orientation of international environmental law, of all environmental law. And it is not coincidental that sustainable development and neoliberalism emerged at roughly the same time and became increasingly tightly linked following the World Conference on Environment and Development in 1987, with, of course, the publication of the Brundtland Report. And as Sam has said, the report formed the basis for an international consensus precisely because it suppressed the contradiction between the ideal of endless extractive growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, the real and sobering limits of the Earth system. And it offered the delusion that mainstream models of development could easily be tweaked, continuously changed, a little bit here, a little bit there, to achieve social justice for everyone, everywhere. But in retrospect, the Brundtland Commission's mandate, one now sees, was to produce a new liberal template for green capitalism, which is now called in the EU green growth. The Brundtland Report was facilitated by the linkage between sustainable development and environmental protection that had been tentatively drawn already, as we know, in Stockholm in 1972, a linkage that became progressively more explicit at all successive global environmental summits. So the Stockholm Conference provided the anthropocentric, utilitarian, and gendered context for all ensuing environmental negotiations, and the creation of international environmental law norms that prioritize the needs of certain humans over those of other vulnerable species and the biosphere. Now, in 2000, environmental sustainability was politically but inadequately institutionalized in the Millennium Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals replaced the MDGs in 2015, as we know. Yet, the absence of an overarching environmental or planetary goal in the SDGs is remarkable, given the times that we live in. And environmental protection is consigned to goals 13, 14, and 15, way down at the bottom of the list of the 17 goals. So numerically and rhetorically, the list effectively makes developmental needs much more important than environmental goals. And we have just published a new paper in Nature that was, the lead author was Frank Bierman. It appeared 3 days ago, where we presented condensed evidence from an analysis of over 3,000 scientific studies on the SDGs that have been published between 2016 and 2021. And our findings suggest that the goals have had some political impact on certain institutions and policies. But this impact has largely been discursive, affecting the way that actors understand and communicate about sustainable development. But more profound normative and institutional changes and impacts, from legislative action to change in resource allocation, remains very, very rare. And it led us to conclude in this study that the scientific evidence that we've surveyed suggests very limited transformative impact of the SDGs. So with respect to the environment specifically, the SDGs contains, as we know, lofty ambitions and very stirring rhetoric, but no reference to or measures of strong ecological sustainability or the need to protect planetary integrity, and no resources to enable the world, especially the global south, to implement the SDGs in genuinely sustainable ways that promote inclusive well-being, as we've heard from one of the keynotes as well this morning. In the SDGs, as in much of international environmental law, truly sustainable development appears as a mantra that can be dispensed with as and when economic and political expediency dictates. So the risk of continuing down this well-trodden path is that environmental law and governance plays a key role in reducing sustainable development to alluring promises that can be achieved, while it inhibits effective responses to the social ecological crisis in ways that are fair, just, and inclusive. It is rather the case, we think, that the combination of sustainable development and neoliberal globalization has remorselessly increased inequality within and between states and made poverty, food, water, and energy security endemic. So environmental law, and this is one of our main theses, environmental law will have to discard sustainable development as its central orientation. And it must pursue alternative worldviews that can counter sustainable development's tenaciously malign influence on the world. So deep structural change will be needed to reorientate environmental law away from neoliberal sustainable development to alternative, ecologically sustainable ways of seeing, of being, of knowing, and of caring. And any reorientation effort will have to consciously embrace a critical awareness of the deeper and enduring structural legacies of Enlightenment rationality, such as anthropocentrism, binary thinking, and the imbalance between legal protection of property and nature that are all being perpetuated by the concept of sustainable development. Sustainable development embodies the circumscribed, hidebound, traditional, and centric legal thinking that has led a growing number of critical legal scholars and other scholars to seek ways to reimagine law and legal theory in more holistic ways that address hierarchies of exclusion, of marginalized humans, the unborn, and of non-humans as well. And we already observe the emergence of these alternative, ecologically sustainable ways of seeing, being, caring, and knowing that offer opportunities to appreciate how worlds are known and enacted so as to more ethically navigate contemporary socio-ecological challenges that face the planet. Buen vivir is an indigenous onto epistemology, for example, and this is the one that we focus on in our paper, that could offer an alternative to sustainable development and that can guide, hopefully to some extent at least, a type of radical reconfiguration of Western environmental law that is being called for. If not fully in practice yet, then at least in theory. Buen vivir promotes a biocentric counterweight to anthropocentrism, in which Pachamama, or Mother Earth, is understood as an ever-present deity who is the source and the sustainer of all life, of which humans are only a very, very small part. Buen vivir offers alternative forms of law and of governance to protect Mother Earth. And it rejects the Cartesian society-nature dualism as well, by assuming a relationship of belonging rather than domination or exploitation. Buen vivir eschews the notion that human beings are at the center of all concern and the only source of values, because we aren't. It involves a broader, more inclusive notion of well-being and cohabitation with the non-human world, which it views as an essential constitutive element of social life with intrinsic value. Well-being flows from communal life in harmony with nature, and it is consistent with principles of reciprocity, complementarity, and relationality. In other words, it's very opposite from the type of values and principles embodied by GDP that Sam has described. There are some encouraging developments that show that Buen vivir is starting to confront mainstream development models in practice. Only two examples. In 2011, an important court decision was handed down in the Vilcabamba River case in Ecuador, upholding that country's constitutional rights of nature provisions. And in 2017, another example is Colombia's constitutional court that ruled that the Atrato River possessed rights, and I quote, to protection, conservation, maintenance, and restoration. And it also established joint guardianship arrangements that are shared between indigenous communities and the national government. Of course, we are very well aware that this alternative worldview does not come without its own inherent challenges, contradictions, disingenuities, and false promises, like sustainable development as well. While optimistic about its potential, we are aware that the implementation of Buen vivir in Latin America has been contradictory and uneven, and that one must always guard against over-romanticizing indigenous onto epistemologies. The reality is, of course, that any perceived or real transformations of law, policies, and ultimately of societies themselves that are brought on by such alternative worldviews will not ever be immediate, unequivocal, or even entirely successful. We need to recognize that Buen vivir remains a work in progress, as do other alternative worldviews that we do not explore here. In short, while Buen vivir evidences the rising disenchantment with mainstream models of development, as we are entering possibly a new post-new liberal period, it is also clear that it is not a panacea, but it does reflect, at least, hopefully, an aspiration to explore alternatives to sustainable development. And it hints at the possibility of dealing in alternative ways with unsustainable growth and development. It explores what it means to be human in the Anthropocene. which I think you will also say something about. And it offers an alternative framing for human, non-human relations, while promoting an ethics of planetary integrity. So in conclusion, the failure of sustainable development to address the deepening socio-ecological crisis indicates that it is fatally disconnected from Anthropocene reality. As the Chinese proverb has it, the moral of sustainable development is that we should be careful what we wish for, because it may come true. Those who believe sustainable development is capable of being reinterpreted and rebranded, such as UNEP or the European Union, have yet to provide a convincing explanation of how to resolve the oxymoron at its core. The impossibility of doing so underpins our contention that it is not credible to believe that sustainable development will ever be genuinely sustainable. It should therefore be rejected as irredeemably flawed for all the reasons we have argued today and that we've set out in detail in our paper that will appear in Law and Critique in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting relation through which we have argued, if I've understood, that the concept of sustainable development is not new. It comes from three core pillars, also known as the Sustainable Development Principles: economic growth, social equity, and environmental protection. The idea behind these pillars is that they are mutually supportive. One cannot exist without the other two. Because humans have an infinite need for natural resources on this planet. The term sustainability should be seen as humanity's purpose to achieve human ecosystem balance, while sustainable development refers to the holistic approach, and temporal processes will bring us to the end point of sustainability. When we will begin to understand how all three pillars work together in order to create a more sustainable world, then we can form our own concept of what it means to be an environmentally friendly citizen. However, I've understood the principle, the concept of sustainable development has been and is still subject to criticism. Modern economies are still looking to reconcile ambitious economic development with the obligations of preserving natural resources and ecosystems for future generations. So the desired result of sustainable development is a state of society when natural resources and ecosystems are used to continue to meet human needs without undermining natural integrity. So thank you. Now I give the floor to another speaker, Madame Holtz, okay, which will give a report by the title "An Ontological Solution to the Ecological Crisis, Bringing Collective Rights to Bear on the Anthropocene."
If you will bear with me, as my title will say, I will just quickly open a PowerPoint presentation. And no, where are we here? No. Oh, no. So my Italian is not so great, but I've worked with Zoom before, so hopefully. Oh. It's best like this. Okay, so people can probably read my notes, so I hope I didn't put anything weird underneath my slides. So we'll see about that. So thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me here, and also thanks very much to the previous speakers. You will probably realize throughout my presentation that I've been actually inspired by some of their works, and I've read a lot of them. So there's definitely some overlap, but also with the first panel, and really within my PhD, which is about collective human rights and climate change. I will not focus on climate change specifically here, but I try to reorient, in this case, human rights, try to take up this challenge of reimagining human rights system to have it more address some of the root causes. I will come to this, that are being brought about by the Anthropocene. So first of all, I might just use the anyways, it was supposed so now you'll just get the full picture when I put it on. Sorry. Oh. Yes. Okay. So first, I'll start off. Oh yeah, of course, it's much better. There we go. Smart. So I'll start off with collective human rights, which is of course the core of my PhD and also of my presentation here. So maybe to start off with a simple, it's not that simple, but a definition of collective human rights. And often collective human rights, and I've heard in the first presentation as well today, are seen as third generation rights. Well, the third generation itself poses some problems. It's usually said to be a response to globalization. So Karl Vasak is the important voice in defining these third generation rights, and it said that they are rights that can only be realized through the concerted efforts of all the actors on the social scene, the individual, the state, public and private bodies, and the international community. So collective human rights are seen as something that is beyond the classical individual versus the state dichotomy that we know in international human rights law. And most well known, of course, of collective human rights is the right to self-determination. But we've also heard there's a right to development, possibly, and it's still being developed as such. There's even a draft convention on this specific right. Then recently, only last year, the Human Rights Council recognized the right to a healthy environment. And now this right is in some jurisdictions seen as an individual right, but in others seen as a collective right. And thus I put it on the slide. And the last one is a right to land. There's no universally recognized right to land, but through certain mechanisms, and I'll go back to this, there is something like a right to land. And maybe the Western concept most closely and most problematic to this right is the right to property. Okay, so I'll just click. So then going to rights holders. So who are rights holders of collective human rights? Who are said to be rights holders of collective human rights? Usually the definition used is that it's human rights that are recognized to be exercisable by collectives, groups of individuals, not reducible to the individual. So there's something about collective human rights that make it more than just the aggregate of individuals. Again, there is some most commonly and hopefully most widely accepted indigenous peoples are holders of collective human rights. But we can also see a movement towards local communities. And this is specifically so in the environmental plane. For example, in the climate change regime, we have the indigenous peoples and local communities platform. So in some ways, this term is being used as an extension of indigenous peoples, even though it's unclear what local communities exactly entail. Then interestingly, and I'll get back to this as well, in 2018, the UN adopted a declaration on peasants and other people living in rural areas. And the definition of peasants specifically is a collective one, and there's also rights within this declaration. Of course, it's non-legally binding, but we're stuck with that most of the time anyways. Some of these rights are said to be both individual as well as collective. And then lastly, I put on this slide, and we've heard this in the presentation before as well, possibly rights of nature. So that is just a short introduction about collective human rights. And so within my research, I look at specifically why should we have collective human rights? And I'm saying this, and maybe it sounds natural to some, but most of the more general accounts of collective human rights are focused on why we shouldn't have them. So, you know, the tension with individual rights, how they should be balanced, and there's more reasons to it. But there is very little analysis of why we should actually recognize and have collective human rights. And when considering this, I went back to ontology, and we had a presentation about ontology. My definition is a little bit different. It flows from anthropology, and it is ways of being with the world. That's how I simply define it. And it's just to indicate that maybe to some of us here, maybe not this audience, it's very natural that we have this particular system, and we've seen it as universal. And actually the human rights system says it is universal. And that's the naturalist system. As one of the four, this is a categorization by De Scola, an anthropologist, which has been criticized, but it's just to give you an introduction in ontology and what differences we have. So our system that we all here live in, I would say, is a naturalist system. And the naturalist system is characterized and influenced by the philosophies of Descartes and Kant, that there is a dissimilarity in interiority, which really means that we identify ourselves as unique in the world based on our minds, ratio. And this is just presented in a way that it's natural, but because we assume a similarity in physicality, so everything else but the ratio, it makes it very easily appropriated by our great minds. And of course, the ratio, even though it's set to accrue to everyone, is not an objective thing. It has a lot of assumptions, and rationalistic assumptions exclude, for example, not only the material world, but also emotions and other things that are not based on this almost economic model of thinking. So this has resulted in a lot of, and I've heard this as well, binaries that we know. So throughout the presentations I heard, for example, tangible, intangible, subject, object, culture, nature is another one. That's the way that we define our world. We see all of these binaries, and I would say there is even a binary in human rights and rights of nature. And there's three others, and I will just group them here because they allow for a similar analysis that doesn't see the human being as being unique and everything else as being below the human being, so easily appropriated and exploited, but recognizes itself in others. And that those are, well, as you see here on the slide, three different types, but all of them see a more holistic picture of being with the world than is the case in a naturalist system. So then I moved back to collective human rights specifically. So as I said, I was looking at why should we have collective human rights? And based on this ontological analysis, so what's out there, I went back to the collective human rights systems. And there's two really that are most widely recognized or incorporate collective human rights. And the first one, which I indicated with the picture on your left, is the African rights system. And so the African rights system knows a system of individual rights, collective rights, and responsibilities. And it is really, it flows from this particular system from African ideas around personhood. So personhood in Africa has a different meaning than our individualist system. So it's becoming a person through other persons. When Vivir was already mentioned, I'll get to that, but this is mostly written about as Ubuntu. And this is also a different development paradigm. So we can already see some of the overlap with the previous presentation and mine. And it's often symbolized by this alligator with two heads, one stomach, but being the idea that, well, dividing them would be a very painful process, one, but also that ultimately you're feeding the same stomach. So going back to one of the earlier presentations about self-interest is not an integral part of this, because it's this community-based thinking. And there is also this duty of care within this idea about personhood around, this is an economical term, but most of you will probably resonate, the common good. And also a set of responsibilities, therefore, to match this. And then on the right, this is actually a depiction of Buen Vivir. We've heard about it. It's an Andean cosmovision, Andean ontology. So it's not representative of all indigenous philosophies, but it's been studied quite a lot recently in relation to rights of nature development paradigm as well. But the idea is to emphasize that here as well, the individual doesn't have a central role, but the central role within indigenous cosmovisions is what's called relationality. For that, I have a quote of an indigenous scholar to give you an idea of what that is. Our land water is our mother, God, friend, and part of our family. We are the children of our land water, therefore they are our parents. Our land water gods live with us, and we can touch them, feel them, respect them, and celebrate with them. Therefore, who I am is for me many relational stories instead of just one. So the idea is that the world is actually devised by having these relationships with everything around you. So it's not just human beings, but it's everything around that. Then I've also mentioned that in both these theories, harmony is also an important part. So it's not this exploitative narrative, but it's more a harmonious being with everything around them. So human beings, but also, and that's vital in the ecological context, nature. And then lastly is hybridity. And there is some interesting research as well about hybridity, the third space. An important part here is that these ontologies don't recognize all of these binaries that I've mentioned. So they're not there, as we can see with Buen Vivir. It combines these three. This is also, of course, a crude picture, but it combines all of these aspects that we love to divide within our system. So having considered these different ontologies, I try to discern a more general theory of collective human rights. So then what are collective rights and how should we see them ideally? And I've really come to two characteristics. And the first is maybe a bit counterintuitive to those that know collective human rights, because they've often, because of this idea of being maybe a remedy to globalization, been equated to the rights of states. Or maybe even the international community of states, as they said. In my view, states cannot be holders of human rights, and there is a closeness to the human experience, in now illustrated through an ontological perspective. So actually there is this sense of locality, and within indigenous cosmovisions, it's often indicated as multinaturalism. So it's not this totalizing nature. We tend to do that. It's even within the individual state narrative, it's either really small or really big. But there is this idea of multinaturalism. And the second is, again, using common good here, but that is an economical theory. So it's just to illustrate what it means, a certain closeness to a common good. And now this closeness, I specifically, and law doesn't like this because of legal certainty, left it quite open or vague. And because there should also be room for specific epistemologies to say what it is. And we love sets of criteria. It's also in line with this legal certainty. But the closeness here, as we can see, can, for example, be defined through responsibilities or relationships. And these two should be seen in conjunction. And that means that there is within collective human rights, no subject-object division, as we love to do and we discussed as well, but they're seen in conjunction. So the object decides whether someone is collective, and whether someone is collective is related to the object they're trying to protect. This also means that it's usually on a smaller scale, but it's not necessarily restricted to it. It's just that it's harder to prove that you have a certain closeness to a common good once you zoom out more and more. But I can think specifically in the climate context of a particular situation where it might be applicable on a larger scale. So if we then go back to the theme of this conference, so I've already mentioned it throughout, but of course it's about ecology and the environment. Why then should we need collective human rights, and how can it help us in the environmental context? And now have this tree here on the right. I would love to say, the root causes of the ecological crisis are actually, and then many people recognize that here, I think, in the room, and I've mentioned it, on the base of neoliberalism, imperialism, neocolonialism, arguably, because, a lot of these narratives, as well as within the human rights regime, are premised on this idea of exploitation. And of course, everything's related to the state. We love to bring everything back to the state, but these collectives can be defined in absence of the state. If we then still apply the idea of collective human rights as entailing more than just the state, and we see it as a measure to counter power imbalances, you can see a way to actually address some of these root causes, or at least to shake this tree a little bit, hopefully. And the second point, I've identified a few more things, but you know, in questions, I'd be happy to go through it. We've heard a lot about future generations as part of sustainable development. I share some of the concerns previously mentioned, but just to emphasize that future generations is a concept which we struggle to grasp with, because we have a linear development of time. We have the past, the present, and the future. And our system is very much focused on the present, so we see it as a separate measure to meet rights of future generations. So how do we do that? Do children hold rights of future generations, etc.? But within specific ontologies, and of course I'm generalizing here, so also the over-romanticism that you've heard is a similar concern here, but concepts of time are not always linear. So sometimes these are circular, as I've tried to indicate with this slide, and they're measured through, for example, natural occurrences. So time is not always that linear process. So within some of these ontologies, you would see that is actually encapsulated in the way of being with the world. So, for example, in many indigenous ontology, you can see that they have a close relationship to the ancestors who, for example, sometimes occupy specific objects around them, whether it's rock, water, etc. But similarly, they already embody the rights of future generations, which is then again also a possibility to address this more fully under the human rights regime. Now, as sort of a caveat, I have to say the idea is not that it transposes individual rights completely. And the idea is that for the human rights regime to be as universalistic as it says that it is, even though, you know, it's a specific worldview that is encapsulated, being the naturalist one, approaching it from this specific narrative, showing where the caveats are within the human rights regime, so why it's not universalistic, might actually drive the conversation to talk about human rights differently. And I think that's very important. I, for example, gave a lecture to master's students back in Leiden, and I asked them, so why do we have human rights? What are they for? And many, more than you might imagine, said, it's just universal values that everyone has. So by changing the narrative, we might be able to move this conversation up as well to address some of these underlying issues as well with the human rights regime. So to wrap up, I want to leave you with this one quote, which I really like and resonated with me throughout, which is by Wildcats, which says, "Can you imagine a world where nature is understood as full of relatives and not resources, where inalienable rights are balanced with inalienable responsibilities, and where wealth itself is measured not by resources, ownership and control, but by the number of good relationships we maintain in a complex and diverse life systems of this blue-green planet?" I can. Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting report. So we can say maybe that the Anthropocene raises new questions about our collective responsibility for the fate of our planet. It pushes us to ask what we owe to future generations, who will face the consequences of today's climate crisis, and what kind of democratic policies are needed to respond adequately. And the Anthropocene, maybe for the first time, raises the question of what to do when the entire human species takes more responsibility for future generations rather than individuals or groups. So, Alessio, we can start the discussion. Okay, the discussion. Have you got any questions? Okay, okay. Emma? I am in complete. Emmanuel. Okay. I am in complete agreement with you. Huh? With you that the ongoing global north, global south is a duplicity by the West to exploit the non-Western countries of their natural resources. Much the reason I do not describe to the usage. I'm just surprised that many academics and scholars are quick to join in the bandwagon usage. I'm conscious that the jargon has been used a couple of times in the morning session. I hope that attendance would take note of the clarity you made of it. The second, thanks for the inspiring presentation. I am also fan of what you call ontologies, and often is referred to alternatives to development. The idea of human dignity, which is the basis for human rights, derives from quite similar ideas, from the mutual recognitions and co-production of humans within community. Have you ever engaged with such personalist thinking? It is a very basis of humanism. Do you think this might help to reconcile humanism and new materialism? Okay. Other questions? Other questions? Other questions here?
You can already practice for your presentation.
C'è un po' di rimbombo.
I need to speak to this. So my question is for the first two presenters. I wanted to ask what your take on weak sustainability and strong sustainability approaches. So basically, strong sustainability gives priority to the environmental pillar of sustainable development as opposed to economic and social pillar. So it was found as a solution to maybe in response to the criticisms you've made about sustainable development. So do you think this can salvage sustainable development as a concept? It might be a new way forward, or should we really do away with development as a concept, and should we really get rid of it, or would prioritizing environmental pillar would be a suitable way of salvaging the current status quo? Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, here's my face again. Okay, thank you very much for the two presenters for your presentation. Actually, I really enjoyed your disenchanting critique of this rhetoric of sustainable development. And I'm totally in agreement with that. Maybe you could get a sense of it out of my presentation. But what I would be interesting in is that in the title of your paper, you speak also about hope. Now, maybe the time was was enough just to make more explicit. And here's my question. Don't you think, in a way, that this kind of hope may come out of a strong narrative, new narrative, and that may implement the kind of change we need? And which kind of subject and instantiations you see as the subject for prompting this new kind of narrative? I don't know, maybe the Friday for Future movement and other kind of new movements that are around. Are they enough in order just to start to prompt this kind of change? I think we need, in order just to find a new way to organize an economic, so to speak, growth that is really sustainable. That is my question, to go into that. And about your presentation, actually, more than a question, I have a concern. And this is the following, is that I think there's a kind of, sorry if I make it very simplistic, and maybe it can make the impression that I'm too hard. But if on the one hand, you are criticizing so much this kind of divide and polarization of positions between the Western way of looking at things and the other, at the end of the day, your reading of this kind of perspectives is very, in a way, very unitarian. I think that there are facets. I don't think that the Western culture is only the one subject object and the others is a more harmonic one. I'm not praising the West against the others, but I think that there, in fact, the fact that we understood what you said gives us the sense that our culture is not a monolithic culture made only of this kind of thing. So maybe what I've missed is this kind of bridge between the two, which comes both from our culture, from the Western culture, and the other culture. So I think that each culture is much more than one culture. There is a pluralistic genesis to which we can go back to in order to be ourselves more pluralistic when trying to find a way out of a situation, a problem. And a second remark, and I don't agree that future generation responsibility harks back to a linear understanding of temporality. When you think about future generation, it's not that we are projecting the future, but the future is in a way haunting us, as I made in my presentation. In a way, we get surprised by this kind of presentation. We are taken out of our present, and that is at all not linear, and it goes a lot into the sense of what other cultures are understanding by the sense of being custodian of something. The one who is custodian actually starts after, as a subject, after the responsibility she is called for. So in this way, the linear temporality gets disrupted, at least. These are my concerns. Thank you.
I have a very short question for Sam. I don't remember the surname. Anyway, I agree completely with you with your description of this endless progress and growth. My curiosity is about a possible solution. In particular, what do you think about the solution proposed, among the others, by Serge Latouche, the idea of degrowth? Because in my opinion, I do not completely agree with him for the simple reason that that kind of perspective maybe could slow down the situation in terms of time, but I think we need a change of direction, a change of paradigm. I think Serge Latouche doesn't change the direction of this crazy train in which maybe we are running all together. That's it. Thank you.
Facciamo solo perché Andrea. Otherwise, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Generally speaking, I would like to stress, in the view of the development, in the sense of our Congress, that this presentation, together with the presentation of this morning, represents a confirmation, maybe I could speak also on behalf of Paolo, of our approach, our idea, that is totally confirmed by your presentation. The fact that dealing with these topics, at the end of the day, we are forced to dealing with foundations, conceptual foundation of our thinking about law, about the institutions, about form of government, democracy, and so on. And maybe one of the outcome, very interesting outcome of our discussion is that it forces us to really think about what I call our legal ground. I totally share all your approach. It seems to me, in order to mention something very famous, very similar to the typical approach of social critical theory of Frankfurt School. And I really like your way of dealing, for example, with the notion of development in a critical way. Two questions. The first one, you sustain, if I understood, that liberal democracy is unsustainable from an economical point of view, but also from an environmental point of view. But at the same time, you sustain that it's better than, politically speaking, other form of organization of power, like the autocracies. I would like to know, of course, not as an answer, because I know that it's a very big question, but as a way of dealing, which are the alternatives? Because maybe we need to think about that. If it's not sustainable from an economical point of view, from the point of view of the environment, we need to think about different form of organization of power, yes or not? Or at the end of the day, we are imprisoned within this conceptual category, that is the category of liberal democracy, with all things that it implies. And so I would like to understand better if you bring to the extreme consequences your criticism about the sustainability of liberal democracy, first of all. Second one, and I'm sorry for that, because maybe it's a sort of invasion of field. So, of course, I'm speaking from the point of view of legal theory, legal philosophy. I would like to stress a point that is typical of international law, international theory. But as regards foundations, even in your presentation, and I might totally agree with you, I totally share this point, there is a critical understanding of the sovereignty, of the idea of sovereignty. Okay. And you mentioned, at a certain point, you mentioned the Kelsenian idea of international law, the primacy of international law. Not I mean according to that, but you mentioned that there is this kind of theory of international law. I mean, here we have. I mean, you mentioned. I didn't understand. I'm not saying that you are following. Sorry.
Just Hans Kelsen's Grundlaw.
Grundlaw, of course. I mean, Grundnorm is a key concept. If you mention Grundnorm, is a key concept of the theoretical apparatus. You cannot, generally speaking, mention the Grundnorm without the theoretical apparatus of Kelsenian theory, which is my point. My point is that there is, in my view, a problem in the grammar, in the sense of conceptual categories of international, that is linked to the fact that even notwithstanding all efforts, all enterprises, we are still linked to a system, a disorder, as you say, system of relationship between sovereign states. And this is actually the point. The convention, the conferences, the international agreement that you mentioned, that we can mention, and that several times, as you mentioned, represent a failure or some failures, are always conventional agreements between sovereign states within the logic of sovereign state. So from this point of view, I know that it is an old-fashioned theory. I know that it is an old Holtz, but in 1920, Hans Kelsen, in The Problem of Sovereignty, affirmed the primacy of international law structurally linked to the removal of the notion of sovereignty, the notion of the idea of the state, of the sovereign state. I think it is not an old theory. Actually, it's a regulative theory that we should deal with again and again. I would like to know basically what you think about the way in which we have to deal with the paradigm of sovereignty in order to follow your critical understanding. To Jolein, yes, to Jolein, I like a lot your presentation. Actually, in my graduation thesis, I worked on this topic, on the topic of collective rights, because as you already know, as you for sure know, it was one of the main topic of now a old-fashioned debate, the debate between liberals and communitarians in the 70s in the States. And so I think that your presentation is a good example of a route that we could follow in order to change our legal grammar. And so for that reason, I agree with Ferdinando, but I mean, not totally, in the sense that it's true that we cannot divide in a strict sense, I mean, what is belonging to Western culture to other culture. We cannot say that the individual rights, Western culture, collective rights, other culture. I agree. But it's also true that in the legal grammar of Western culture, there is no, culturally speaking, or there was no until now, in a strict sense, space for collective rights. The idea of collective rights is still today a challenge for our legal system that are based on the primacy of individual rights in a liberal fashion. And so I think that is a good route, the route of collective rights as a route that is able to open a different perspective, different grammar from a legal point of view in order to deal with ecology, protection of nature, and so on. I would like just to know, from an ontological point of view, if your understanding of collective rights is linked with a communitarian ontology or not. Of course, I am influenced by the terms of the debate between liberals and communitarians, because the liberal criticism against all people from the communitarian side that put forward the idea of collective rights was that they put forward a disputable ontology, the ontology of the primacy of community over individual. For example, Charles Taylor maybe is the best scholar among the scholars that worked with the idea of collective rights, tried to find a balance between these two, I mean, different sides. But I would like to know if there is this ontological presupposition communitarian in a certain sense. Thank you.
It looks like going to the doctors, you know, one after another, asking questions, sitting in front of the doctors. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much for your presentations. And the more questions, the better the presentation. So, it's a very good signal. So, the fact that sustainable development failed to address the crisis means that the question which was asked by Christopher Stone nearly 50 years ago, should trees have standing? The answer to this question is negative, right? So, and in the current crisis, it seems that the states are very unlikely to drop Anthropocene approach to solving the problems in this state of terrible disorder we are having. So what could be the solution? And my question is, if we try to use purely economic tools, I mean, from the legal international legal perspective, and to preserve and to protect environment. What do I mean? For instance, we have such an experience at WTO, like carbon taxes, eco-labeling, eco-subsidies, and general exceptions specifically focused at environmental protection. Also, we have a case when purely trade term from the GATT was interpreted using Biodiversity Convention and Rio Declaration on Sustainable Development. So there are some examples how these trade, in this instance, tools may be used specifically as environmental protection tools. So my question is, what if we consider that economic growth, as you described, includes not only growth itself, but harm as well, including environmental harm. And there is a debate in international law, how should we define harm to the environment? Traditional and narrow approach is to include only harm to natural resources and to property. What if we extend this notion and include there the environment as such, the ecosystem as such? And what if we submit that we do it not only for the purpose of pure, let's say, social approach, but we include this to consider this environment from the economic perspective, and we show that it is economically beneficial to preserve environment. So it's purely economic approach for preservation of environment. And therefore, we may somehow overcome these opposite positions between economic interests and environmental interests within the sustainable development, showing that it's economically beneficial to present the environment. And that is the growth, in a sense, of today's current environmental crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. If I may just take off from where you left, which was the ambient concept. I was just wondering if you think there is enough research to look at in the field of legal anthropology, to sort of go beyond the concept and to kind of look at the legal frameworks or any kind of ordering frameworks that they might be in the indigenous communities, to look at what is the indigenous concepts of law and ordering, or of values or rights and obligations. So is there enough legal anthropological research? Because I mean, I've just looking at the UK, even to find legal anthropologists, it's very, very difficult. And whether this is something that we need to focus on, and whether there's any Western interests against the growth of legal anthropology as well. So something on that. Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on that fourth right, the right to land, with the question mark that you had put in your slide. The first thing that came to my mind is, of course, property rights, and that's, you know, typical, and we're not talking about that. But then right to land is really territory, isn't it? And that's part of statehood as well. It's quite interesting then, you know, what is the collective conception of right to land that you think? And I also thought of, I don't know if you've heard of this instrument, pardon me if you haven't, It's the VGGT, the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of land, forest, fisheries in the context of national food security by the Food and Agriculture Organization's FAO, right? It's quite an unprecedented instrument. It's not a treaty, but still it has some mechanisms where, lots of countries report on. Of course, like Lee and Sam were talking about, there is a underlying instrumentalism about why that kind of customary rights to land is being recognized through the VGGT. It's because you want agriculture and food security and want to reduce the disputes, and therefore, the food industry can also benefit from that as well. So they have security of investment. So there is, in all the concepts we have now in international related sustainable development, there is an underlying theme of neoliberalism, I guess, in that. So I was just wondering, any thoughts and comments on that aspect of right to land, but in connection perhaps to some international declarations of it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for those questions. We will try to make a coherent response to them. So, and to join up the different questions. First, in relation to weak and strong sustainable development, I challenge you now to tell me if strong sustainable development puts environmental protection above social justice and economic growth at the bottom, which country in the world follows strong sustainable development? Anybody? I can think of one, possibly, Costa Rica, but it is certainly not the EU and green growth. In terms of the question about hope, I often feel that I'm researching and writing from despair because we are in a desperate situation. But writing from despair is actually a good thing because I think we have to hit the bottom in order to start climbing out of the hole that we're in order to seek different ways. So you talked about paradigm shift. I've written quite a lot on the need for a paradigm shift in law and legal theory. And one of my favorite quotes is from Albert Einstein, who said that no problem can be solved at the same level of consciousness that created it. And part of the level of consciousness that has created the problem, as Louis referred to, is law and environmental law. We have to stop thinking in traditional, conventional, doctrinal, black letter legal ways. They are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We all know about business as usual, but business as usual is development. It's sustainable development. A problem we have as legal scholars is law as usual, and we can't go on in this way. Now, the question about whether Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, other things are enough, no, but they are a vital part of dealing with the climate emergency. The climate regime, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Biological Diversity, etc., are state-centric, sovereign-centric, top-down instruments that have failed and will continue to fail because they are not designed to succeed. The only way we can do this is from the bottom up, through activism, through politics. And that's why people like Fridays for Future are so important. And as Greta Thunberg says, we need to do at least two things: follow the science and treat the emergency as an emergency. Now, this raises a broader question about, and again, I want to challenge you. Do you think we can deal with global heating, biodiversity loss, the sixth mass extinction, under capitalism? I see people shaking their heads no. So we have two choices here. One, if we believe that we can do this under capitalism, we need to think about what kind of capitalism, whether it's labeling, whether it's taxes, whether it's carbon markets, people getting rich from trading in carbon, etc. If we can't do it under capitalism, then we have to look at fundamental, radical political, social, and economic transformation in order to leave a habitable planet for future generations. Now, I don't think we can do this under capitalism. Part of our presentation about development, sustainable development, and the link to growth is that, as Marx said, money that doesn't grow is not capital. Growth is at the heart of the logic of capitalism. That's what capital does. It grows, and growth destroys the environment. So we are confronted with existential choices. I'm not saying anything new, but we can talk, we can be environmentally green citizens, etc. But no individual can bring about the change, sufficient structural and institutional change that is required. In relation to international law, the history of international law is directly connected to colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperialism. The progenitors of international law, Vattel, Grotius, etc., constructed an international system that was designed to enable Europe to expropriate and exploit the natural resources of what today we call the global South. In terms of rights, just basically, next month, the UN General Assembly will begin debating whether to adopt a right to a healthy environment. Which I would just say, is that a collective or an individual right? And why is it going to be? It will probably be passed with some countries against the usual suspects in a non-binding General Assembly resolution rather than some more enforceable binding form of international law. In terms of harm and assessing and understanding harm, Louis has done a tremendous amount of work in Earth system science. So there's the planetary boundaries framework, it's Earth system science. There is the life sciences, all give us knowledge and information about how to assess and measure harms, such as overfishing, for example. I meant to, just in relation to the question about degrowth and Latouche, etc. I don't think that the degrowth, people who are arguing for degrowth are arguing for degrowth everywhere. And it's not purely economic, it's also a state of mind. There is also something called steady state economics, that countries that are developed as most of the EU, certainly Italy, UK where I am, Germany where Louis is at the moment, there is no need for further growth. The problem is not lack of the need for more growth. The problem is maldistribution. The problem is that a narrow proportion of people have most of the wealth in their hands. We can fund more environmentally positive forms of economic activity. We can have health systems with the levels of wealth that exist in the major Western developed countries. Finally, on the question of whether it is economically beneficial to save the environment, well, yeah. But we need to save the environment from the damage that is being done to it by sustainable development. So, yeah, the paradox of a lot of this is that this history of environmental destruction is driven by the anthropocentrism that we have mentioned collectively. But in order to be truly, if you really want to advance the needs and interests of human beings, anthropocentrism, you need to be much more ecocentric and biocentric. That's the paradox. And in relation to legal anthropology, I'm not sure whether I would call it absolutely legal anthropological literature. But if you look at countries like Canada, there is a huge amount of work that is done on indigenous law and stuff like that. Our work on buen vivir in Latin America, and I'm sure there is probably quite a lot of work on indigenous perspectives of law in India and South Asia.
Right, so I will try to be brief and maybe answer some of the questions in conjunction, hopefully. Thank you everyone for the lovely questions and comments, and actually it gives me a little bit of an opportunity to say some things that I wasn't able to say in my presentation, and maybe to define a little bit more, you know, what I mean with collective human rights, and specifically to address some of the concerns that I've heard. So the idea of collective human rights, the inspiration of designing a general theory, and I emphasize that here, I'm presenting a general picture, and of course there's different specificities. But the general idea is that collective human rights have sprung from this idea that there should be space for different ontologies. So, I mean, sometimes, you know, there's a new concept. It's not that new. It's within the systems of collective human rights that we have. We can see that there is this clear link to ontology. So my idea was to derive inspiration from that, try to see what is a general theory of collective human rights and how should we see these rights. And also this idea is beyond culture. I mean, when people ask me usually questions about collective rights, I hear a lot of cultural rights dimensions, but it's not. And it's specifically also to merge binaries such as culture and nature that we have. So it's not just cultural rights. And I think the interesting discourse here, and that I wanted to highlight, is the peasants' rights discourse, which we can specifically see that the definition of peasants is someone that has a special relationship to the land. So they define it quite collectively, but they specify in specific rights, among which the right to land, that it can be exercised both collectively and individually. And I think for some this might be a weird thing, because a lot of people still have the idea that collective rights are somehow opposed to individual rights. It can be in a particular case, but by its nature, there is no empirical evidence that it is. And I think the peasant rights discourse shows it's worldwide. It originated from the global south. It's also one of the discourses that is most bottom up, which is really interesting if we're talking about those processes. And but it also has people in the global north, for example, France, that advocates on the basis of La Via Campesina. That's the organization that's mostly advocated for this. So I construe this, and I'm researching this right now, as that there's an adaptability to a specific regime that we're in, and we need that adaptability. So within our general system where we have individual rights, you know, we are well accommodated with these individual rights, and it can accommodate for the differences that I heard you say. You know, it's not that clear cut. I recognize that, but rights to culture, for example, the individual right to culture can accommodate for instances like that, but it's within this specific system. But outside of this system, certain rights can adapt to being collective. And I think we also need different solutions within our general neoliberal system, which is what individual rights essentially are. And that's the second thing I wanted to illustrate, that's the rights of nature. So I mentioned this briefly, but there's different ways to conceptualize rights of nature. Sometimes it's taking together with indigenous populations. So the Wanganui River in New Zealand, there it's even though, you know, ultimately it was balanced with somehow something again with the state, but the idea was that the Maori are the persons that are protecting the river. But if we, for example, look at the Latin American countries that have recognized rights of nature, we can see that indigenous peoples are actually the ones that do not use these rights because it's ingrained in what they are already doing. So I think rights of nature could be a very useful concept, but it's also something that might be really necessary within our specific context of individual rights, of, you know, generally this idea of I don't want to say superiority, but a little bit, to actually counteract this system that we have. So you use the system that we have in place. So I'm not using the binaries, oh, it's wrong or good. One ontology is good, the other one's wrong. But we need to adapt our solutions. Then I didn't really use the concept, so that was Klaus's question of human dignity. I know a little bit about like a list of sort of the priorities that we need. I think that was the, I really dislike lists. I don't know if I mentioned this, but the idea that there is a clear distinction or hierarchy, I think is very dangerous if you're applying it on a universalist level, even though, you know, it'd be interesting to see to what degree these match up and don't, but I do not do that within my research specifically, so I wouldn't have the answer maybe that you were hoping for. As relation to the communitarian vision, I think this is one of the difficulties with collective human rights and why they haven't been used a lot or developed a lot, because it sort of got caught up in this whole state-centered discussion about a state model. And my theory really, you know, it takes a step back from that idea. So it's also not the idea that a specific ontology should be forwarded or should be state policy, etc. It's really to counteract the state system that we have. So I've dealt with it, for example, through self-determination to flesh out what the difficulties are, but then clearly do not use it when defining collective human rights. Then just shortly on future generations and linear development, I think I put it quite generally, but I specifically focus on climate change, and the idea of future generations in this regard was related to this problem which is called irrational discounting, in which to take measures, we love cost-benefit analyses, they discount future costs because we're not sure whether they will happen. So there is this difficulty with dealing with the future because it's not happening right now, and that means it doesn't have the priority because it's only happening so maybe linear wasn't the right choice of words, but it's really to counteract this specific problem, and that of course my research itself on climate change was specifically related to irrational discounting, but of course that is a broader problem. And then I hope I'm going through all of this. Then the right to land. So I'd love to chat about this a little bit more as well, but within my chapter I take 3 different approaches. So the right to property, which of course is often used as a tool of power. In my world, human rights are actually used to not embed these powers, but to counteract them. So we can see even, you know, in the history of the adoption of or the non-inclusion of the right to property in the covenants on economic and social and cultural rights, that it's also given us a clear social dimension. So it's not just this economical term. So moving from that, you know, within the, again, Western, and this is general systems, it might have a value beyond that, but I specifically focused on the right to food sovereignty, and this is, you know, this is so also the important part of distinguishing with cultural perspective, because peasant right might be cultural, has a strong cultural aspects, but it's also very much social and economic. It's really about sustenance, you know, small scale farming. So this idea of food sovereignty, which was specifically designed to counteract the neoliberal system. There is a lot of literature is actually saying we did not pursue this under the right to food, but we're choosing a new right to actually being able. So these are really interesting discussions, which again feed in the ideas that I have. Secondly, the right to cultural heritage. There is a certain right to land developed in that, and of course indigenous rights too. So we can see the concept everywhere. As you said as well, it's very territorial, but we have to see that, you know, even the rights discourse itself, rights are usually seen as entitlements, and this is already a certain model. So it's really hard to navigate, and there's always, of course, some disadvantages, which is also why in collective rights there's an emphasis on responsibilities. So I might just conclude with the idea that if we pursue collective human rights in this way, of course, it's not a silver bullet. We don't have those. We need to pursue different possibilities. But collective human rights might actually, if established in this way, and actually being, which it has, for example, in the African inter-American system being judicialized in this way, might pose more strong limits on growth. So you can imagine if it's also pursued in the peasant context, in the indigenous context, that there's just more, there is fewer opportunities for exploitation, because we live in this state-centric system, and I wish we didn't. But if you pose certain limits, you might be actually, through the human rights discourse, contributing through collective human rights. That's my dream, in a certain sense, to a measure of degrowth by actually posing limits to growth and natural resource exploitation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just briefly, I see that we're almost 40 minutes over time, so I'll keep it very brief. On your issue of hope, that didn't come out as clear as it should have in the paper. I think we see signs and seeds of hope. We see this in rising forms of climate litigation. We see this in youth movements, your example. We also see it in more critical scholarship. The stuff that we are talking about here hasn't really been spoken about this intensively and at this scale and at this level of criticism forever. It's only in the more recent years that we are doing this, and I think this is very positive. As an overarching answer, or not answer, but reflection on state sovereignty and so forth, I think that we need to recognize that the legal order that we have has been designed to address a post-Second World War crisis, but that crisis has changed. So the law is not responsive anymore to the crisis. It's a different crisis. It is now also one of war, as we see. It will always be, but it has become, what Sam has said, a polycrisis was the term that you used. And our laws cannot respond to that, and it needs to do that. And I think we would need 4 forms of transformation for that: transformation of science and knowledge systems, also recognizing that it's not only European northern forms of science that would be important, but also indigenous forms of science and anthropological studies, for example, that would be able to inform this. We would need transformation of paradigms, and that is not only a question for the law, of course, that's also a question for politics. It's also a question for economics. Law will not solve the crisis, but it is an important ingredient towards that purpose. We need a transformation of discourses, which is what we're doing here, and I think that's very positive. Although I'm still astounded that one often sees courses that are being taught and things that you read that always fall back on this bounded conservative terminology, despite the fact that we know that this terminology and arguments that we've made 30 years ago aren't suitable anymore. And then, of course, ultimately, we need transformation of social behavior, which would require collective effort, not only from law, economics, and politics as well. I think what could be useful is to really, in practical terms, and this might be utopian, but to try and negotiate a new overarching global treaty. There was this attempt, the Global Pact for the Environment, who most of you should know, it probably knows about. It was a massive failure because what it did, it simply copied and pasted all of the old principles of international environmental law in a new type of agreement that was French-led, very politically, nothing against the French, but politically motivated also for French interests. And it was written by, I was on that panel, a set of global experts without any consultancy, without any inputs from other sectors of society and the academia, which makes that the result is that agreement loses it has democratic deficiencies. It doesn't have any legitimacy. You can't expect that the world would believe and adopt an agreement that a set of academics have thought out in a back room over a weekend. That's not how it would work. I think what would be more productive is if one could follow, despite the critique against the Sustainable Development Goals, the procedure that was followed to adopt the goals, which was much more inclusive, consultative, broad-based, and it has more democratic legitimacy. That is probably the biggest success of the SDGs. Well, of all the other international agreements, you must agree.
David Cameron was one of the people who was in part of that process.
So as you can see, we also don't always agree on everything. But instead of a top-down treaty that's being negotiated between states, that's typical state-central system, there are alternative approaches that could be followed to give it more legitimacy. And I think it should at least include a set of principles that could guide the further development of law. And these principles should cover 3 categories, I would say. And that is structural principles. In other words, how should the structure of the law look to respond to Earth system governance challenges? And I can think of one principle, the principle of systematicity, for example, or systems thinking. The law should be able to recognize the fact that everything in the Earth system is interlinked. Having a climate regime, biodiversity regime, they all essentially deal with the same problem. But the law doesn't recognize that. Second set of principles would be architectural, would be behavioral principles such as degrowth, we've discussed this, and the principle of sufficiency, for example. If something is sufficient, it's enough, full stop. And then the final category would be ethical principles, the types that we already spoke about. Planetary integrity, and yes, strong sustainability, which is just, I think, another term, always in my view, of ecological sustainability. It's just another term for that. But that is the type of principles that we need, and the principle of planetary stewardship. Thanks.